Hello, this is Mr. Smith, also known as Teach Smith on YouTube. This is comparing power and conflict poems, remains and war photographer, the week commencing the 15th of June 2020. So, as usual, we will start with an Inspectacles spag starter. Remember, there will be a few spag errors and you can either rewrite the paragraph or rewrite the words and phrases that are incorrect. The play is set in 1912, but was written and first performed in 1947, which means that the characters have no knowledge of significant events like the two world wars or the sinking of the Titanic. So please pause the video, find the mistakes and correct them. So some spag errors, but also some knowledge errors here. So written was spelled incorrectly, performed, but also it was performed in 1945, interestingly for the first time in Russia. Characters were spelt wrong, knowledge was spelt wrong, and remember, of course, Titanic is a proper name, so it needs a capital T. So on to the main topic of the video. We have covered what I would call a power cluster of the poems, namely Ozymandias, London and My Last Duchess. Now we'll be moving on to a conflict cluster, namely Bayonet Charge, War Photographer and Remains. I've just put them here chronologically, though today we'll be looking at Remains and War Photographer. Let's begin with the question. Compare how poets present ideas about conflict in Remains and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. Remember, you will always get the named poem in front of you in your exam, and then you need to think about one other appropriate poem to compare. Again, all poems can compare to each other, but there are clusters that make sense and make the job a bit easier. So a reminder then, the main messages of the poem Remains. Armitage, the poet, remember it's about the poet doing something. So Armitage explores the moral questions surrounding conflict, and I've phrased this in a specific way and you'll come to see why. So by moral questions we mean, when is war ever right? Is it ever right? When is killing ever right? When is it right? When is it wrong? What personal responsibility does the soldier have for killing? What responsibility lies with the commanders? And then following from that, Armitage explores the guilt the soldier struggles with, because remember, this is about one soldier and the guilt that he feels after shooting someone. So a bit of context for Remains. It's from a collection of poems called The Not Dead, all poems about discharged soldiers. So they've not been killed in war, however they have, the title I think implies that they've somehow been damaged otherwise. The fact that, you know, instead of calling them just the soldiers, it's the not dead. It's interesting implications there. So Remains is about a real soldier called Guardsman Tromans, who was in Iraq and was a machine gunner. So it's really important to remember that Salman Armitage is not writing about his own experience. He's not a soldier. He's a poet. He's trying to portray the experience of another soldier. And more than that, he's trying to explore issues around this, explore issues around conflict, actual wars, and perhaps conflict inside a person's mind, an internal conflict, as it were. Because you could say that that's what guilt is. Guilt is an internal conflict. So why compare Remains and War Photographer? So I really want you to think back, if you can, to War Photographer. What is War Photographer about? If you don't remember, never mind, we'll cover it in a moment. But if you do remember, please think about what Remains and War Photographer may have in common in terms of ideas, issues explored, imagery even. Have a think about this, please. So the main messages of the poem War Photographer. So Carolyn Duffy explores the moral questions surrounding conflict. So I've put that in a way to directly link it with Remains. But it is about morality. It is about the morality of the war photographer. The position that he or she is put in and how they struggle with this. Duffy explores the guilt the war photographer struggles with. Again, I frame this so that it links back to Remains. The war photographer has his own kind of guilt in this poem. It's a different form of guilt. It's guilt for different reasons, but it is still guilt. Again, that internal conflict. Carolyn Duffy was friends with war photographers, which is what inspired this poem. It's very important to realise that in 1985, the year I was born, funnily enough, it was about developing film, not digital. You had to use a darkroom, you had to use developing solution in order to develop the pictures. Duffy is basically discussing, and she says this herself, has said this in an interview before, the difficult decisions a war photographer would have to make. So I've come up with these points. Both face moral dilemmas, moral problems, which are used to explore wider moral problems around conflict. Both the war photographer and the soldier suffer guilt. I was thinking about Remains being a monologue in free verse. It could be a confession. It could be a confession of his crimes, a confession of his sins. And then perhaps in an interesting link, it's almost as though the war photographer is the priest hearing confession, hearing sins or having to deal with sin, having to see and hear awful things, which is reflected in a rigid structure because a priest or the war photographer would have to try and maintain control in the face of all that horror. Again, I know the third structural point is quite tricky, so don't worry about that if you're struggling, but look at the poem Remains again and think about where the soldier is struggling with a moral dilemma or is faced with a moral dilemma, and then find a quotation which demonstrates his guilt. So quotation for a moral problem, a moral conflict you could say, and a quotation for guilt. Classic quotation to use for the moral dilemma is probably armed, possibly not. So this is the real source of the guilt, or one of the main sources of guilt for the soldier. The looter that he shoots with two other soldiers, it's likely that the looter had a gun, but it's not definite. And this is the source of the problem, because as a soldier, if he shoots someone else that is armed, there is a moral justification for that. We may not still agree, however, there is a moral justification under the rules of combat, as there are rules to wars. However, if there was no gun, it's essentially a murder, and that is a very, very difficult thing to have to deal with, and as a result the soldier suffers terribly. And that links to the next quotation, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Again, if you studied Macbeth, as I know my year 10 have, that idea of blood on your hands being guilt. The blood on your hands meaning guilt. And something I've noticed, which I find quite an interesting progression, when he's talking about seeing the looter, he blinks and he sees the looter, he sleeps and he sees the looter, and he dreams and he sees the looter. So it's always, the looter is always there. And the confession is perhaps trying to be a way of finally being able to let go of his memories or make peace with his memories. Anything you can think of from war photographer that shows he's in a moral conflict, or he feels guilt, or that he's like a priest, anything you can remember. If not, you may want to turn to the poem. I put a link below, and I've also put a link in Show My Homework. Otherwise, I will show you what I mean in a moment. So the moral dilemma that the war photographer feels is that he is taking photos of people in perhaps the most private moments or their most vulnerable moments, just before death or in death, and he doesn't know them personally. He has to sell these pictures as well to make money, so it feels like it could be exploitative, and that is expressed well in this quotation. A half-formed ghost. It's a half-formed ghost because the photo is starting to form in the developing solution, but it's also because the war photographer doesn't know this person well, doesn't know them personally, and also they're a half-formed ghost because they're halfway perhaps or nearly on their way to death, so they're on their way to becoming a ghost. Really powerful quotation, that, the half-formed ghost, about the sense of detachment the war photographer has to feel, about the pain and death that he witnesses and having to make a living from this. The guilt, the shaking of the hands. Again, I really like the link of the hands showing guilt. In the War Photographer poem, it's hands shaking, and it remains it's the soldier still seeing blood on his hands. And again, that priest imagery, the priest preparing a mass. Apologies, I didn't have that quotation on there, but you can look that up in the poem. Not a bad idea for you to try and go away and do independently, in fact. Credit to Mr. Bruff and one of the comments made under his video. The rhyme scheme and the structure of the stanzas is 4 stanzas of 6 lines, which actually represents the dimensions of a old-fashioned print photograph. So again, it's the idea of all this horror contained within the tight boundaries of a photograph. So starting again with the poets' names to show that this is a construction, it's a constructed poem. Armitage and Duffy both explore the guilt felt by the central figure in each of their poems. So again, that link immediately. It remains the soldier continues to suffer guilt long after he has shot the looter, and Armitage ends the poem with the soldier describing his bloody life in my bloody hands. The repetition of bloody emphasises how violent the killing was, and it could also be the soldier cursing the situation, so bloody as in bloody hell. Furthermore, the amount of blood could also signify the weight of guilt that the soldier feels. The soldier used his hands to fire the gun that shot the looter, along with others, so the blood is still seen on his hands. Duffy also uses the image of hands to portray guilt in War Photographer, so again reinforcing that link that I've made in the image. As the photographer is developing the film, solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. The photographer's hands, spag mistake there, did not shake in the war zone, as that would have ruined the pictures, but shake now, perhaps due to stress or guilt or anger. The sibilant solution slop emphasises how badly the photographer's hands are shaking, as it is disturbing developing solution. It is possible that both the soldier in remains and the photographer in War Photographer are angry at the poor planning or sloppy solutions that have led to the guilt that they feel. The soldier is forced to police a bank, the photographer tries to portray the horrors of war, perhaps hoping to make things better, but they do not care. I'm trying to push it a bit by saying that they're both angry because the solutions to conflicts, the solutions to wars, and the solutions and plans in Iraq were both faulty or sloppy, which led to the soldier and the war photographer being put into positions they didn't want to be put into. So Year 10, I hope this lesson has been helpful. If other students have been watching, or perhaps even teachers, I hope this has been helpful. This is Mr. Smith, also known as Teach Smith on YouTube. Thank you very much.